from an economic and business perspective, how has Hong Kong and China melted together? And how important has Hong Kong been to that process?
There are 7 million, maybe a few more in Hong Kong. 7 million people. There are 1.3 something billion in China. And it always stood to reason that as China became more prosperous, the figures would start to shift very significantly. When I left Hong Kong, and none of this is because of me, it's because of a lot of things. When I left Hong Kong, Hong Kong was worth about 17% of the Chinese GDP. Today, I think the figure is 3%. And that's not because Hong Kong's necessarily been doing badly, though the growth rate has slowed a bit for a number of reasons which we might discuss, that I'm not as expert in it as I was. But the reasons for that change have been the same as the reasons for China overtaking the United States, at least in PPP terms, in its size. China and India until the 1820s represented over 50% of the world's GDP. And that collapsed in the 19th century and the 20th century, partly because of the depredations of Western imperialists, partly because of what was happening with the Industrial Revolution, partly because of decisions which the Chinese and Indians themselves made. The Indians with a constitution which embraced socialism, the Chinese because of civil wars and
sure.
so on. There are a variety of reasons. So the balance between economies and therefore between countries shifts very significantly. And there is, of course, a sense in which the Chinese extraordinary and extended spurt must have made a lot of people in Beijing think that they didn't really need Hong Kong as much as they thought they would back in the 1980s and 90s. I'm not sure how much they ever understood Hong Kong. And there are some aspects to it which they plainly still don't understand. I think that repeating one country, two systems is fine. But I don't think that many Chinese leaders, with some exceptions, have understood what that really means, what the Hong Kong system is. Not just capitalism, but all the things that one associates, the hardware and software, and most important of all, the rule of law, which I think is one of the biggest reasons for Hong Kong's economic success. When I first went as governor, and I didn't go very much as governor to China, but when I first went for some talks, I was trying to explain what I meant by the rule of law to my very intelligent and actually rather nice opposite number, who's dead now, Lu Ping, what the rule of law meant. And I said that a couple of years before, I'd spent some time as Britain's Environment Secretary, the biggest domestic department in Britain, responsible for all sorts of things from local government, finance to housing construction and so on. And they were all areas where there was a lot of policy which was justiciable. And I said that I would say to our lawyers, when another point was challenged in the courts, I'd say to them, are we going to win this one? And they would say, no, I don't. I mean, maybe we will, maybe we won't. And some days we won, and sometimes we didn't win. And I was trying to make the point to him that the rule of law applied to me as well as to everybody else. And he replied by saying, well, we have rules of law. I said, that's not the same thing. I mean, it may suit your circumstances. But rule by laws is not the same as the rule of law. Because the rule of law applies to the rulers as well as the ruled. And ultimately, the law for a business becomes the law that you and I have to follow in our personal day-to-day social, economic behavior. So I think there are some really considerable conceptual difficulties involved in the relationship between Hong Kong and Beijing. And they wouldn't exist to the same extent, interestingly, if you were talking about the relationship between Hong Kong and Singapore or Hong Kong and India.
Right.
Both of which have in different ways and not beyond criticism, both of which have the rule of law and independent courts. One of the things that used to interest me was how often mainland companies which had disputes between themselves would come to Hong Kong to have the courts in Hong Kong adjudicate them. And I thought that was the best possible argument for the Hong Kong rule of law and for understanding the relationship between the hardware and software of Hong Kong's way of life and economic success.
I kind of see that Hong Kong has become the Switzerland of China in many ways. And they've used it as an experiment. I mean, that was when I first went there, 92. I went to the first capital markets summit held by Citibank in Beijing. And we went to see someone in the Politburo to brief them. And I think at the time, Nobel Prize winner Harry Markowitz, who used to work for Yamaichi, explained to them that the New York capital market was the biggest in the world. And the translator turned around and said, well, we're a little bit confused. We always thought the Hong Kong capital market was the biggest in the world. And I feel that Hong Kong became this experiment at that point. It was the social markets experiment, and then the stock exchange listings happened, and the red chips, the H shares, all happened. And it was an experiment that no one knew where it was going, but that was Hong Kong's role. And I think that has, over the last 20 years, been an amazing role, as you've seen now, the globalization of the Chinese corporate machine.
But interestingly, the international comparisons that have been done, I mean, rather academically, suggest that in terms of corporate governance, China is not yet anywhere near India's standards. And I think that is why
the rankings come out from CLSA every year, and they're always a little bit low, and they suffered for that.
Yeah, they have, and they've suffered in terms of attracting investment, not least when they're operating abroad. I mean, I'm not saying that.
We saw it in New York when their PE ratios dropped to 1, and 150 companies were privatized. But those same 150 companies that were privatized, like take something like Perfect World, which was capitalized at 800 million, was relisted in the local market at 10 billion.
Yeah.
So they've used the capital markets in a very interesting manner, I believe. And I also believe, and this goes back to the systemic discussion that I would like to have, is that the systems that we're looking at are all seem to be melting together, or in my mind, falling apart, in that there's not that much difference anymore between capitalism, socialism, and communism, if you call China communist. But what is interesting is that maybe, I was thinking about this as I read your book, that maybe what China has done is created a different kind of communism through the capitalist machine. And what they have done, if you look at it closely, is they've created wealth for their people by, for example, listing groups like China Mobile, Sinopec, China Telecom. These are some of the biggest enterprises in the world, yet China owns 60-70% because they haven't floated. They've only floated 20 or 30%. So you still have tremendous wealth, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that have been created in the corporate machine, which you don't have in, let's say, a place like America, which the government doesn't own AT&T, doesn't own Mobile Exxon. I thought this was very interesting.
But there's of course a question about, as you suggested, about what communism means, and it's legitimate for the Chinese to say, we'll tell you what communism means. But it's a curious definition now.
It is.
Because if you look at the proportion of GDP taken by remuneration, in the period when China was expanding most rapidly, the proportion of GDP taken by remuneration was falling like a stone. So the money was going to all sorts of places, including investment or in low-yielding foreign assets. But it wasn't going into social programs in a big way, and it wasn't going into work.
It was going into infrastructure. The infrastructure has been amazingly built.
No, the infrastructure has been built, hence the astonishing figures for concrete and steel.
Yeah.
And it's something which local government can do. But I'd have difficulty reconciling what has happened in China with what Marx or Engels wrote about communism. I might have an easier time reconciling what Lenin wrote with what's happening in China. But they're entitled to say, look, we found a system which suits us. The questions I think we can legitimately ask are rather existential. The first is, one knows perfectly well that, as in every country, there is political discussion and argument. And there is a political argument, has been for years in China, between those who think that if the party continues to give up control over the state, over the economy, it will sooner or later lose control of the state. So you can't continue to privatize publicly owned companies, whatever the figures tell you about rates of return. On the other hand, the private sector, which is so much more efficient and productive, has its defenders who say, look, unless the party continues to step back from managing large parts of the economy, it will certainly lose control over the state, because we won't grow as fast and because we won't create as many jobs. And it always seemed to me that a reason for sympathy with the problems of the Chinese leadership is that both those propositions are completely true. And finding a way, plotting a way through that predicament, through that dilemma, is not very easy. I also think that there is a wealth of evidence, not necessarily always clear, that the societies which do best in a sustainable way the longest are those which manage to combine open political and economic systems, because the two feed off one another. And I think you see that even where the openness of the political system is less than perfect or even questionable.
But in some ways, when you point that out in your book again and again, it's more like it's the best alternative. But you don't seem to. But is it the perfect alternative? And the other thing that this is what I really wanted to understand is that in theory, it all seems to make sense, but in practice, humanity doesn't seem to really respect the dignity that is given to them in the liberal democracy, and then they're greedy. They're doing this. They're doing that. and is it easier, for example, for China to have rebuilt itself by saying, okay, we need to build this high-speed train. We need to build this because we need to join these countries. And then you try to do that in Paris or Rome or something like that, and it takes you 5 times longer. So there's a whole concept of that you bring up in your book that, yes, it is it's the best alternative that we have, but is it necessarily a good alternative? Is there a better one that we can find in the future?
I don't think there is a better one than trying to involve people in shaping their own destiny. And that has political repercussions. What I totally accept, philosophically, because I'm a Tory, is that life is not a journey to like a wagon train. You go across the prairie and then suddenly you find paradise, and there are running streams, and there's leaping salmon, and there's, if you're lucky, oil. I think life is a series of predicaments. And the older I get, the more I've believed that. So I'm very alive to the argument that to try to find or impose perfect systems is crazy. To argue against, say, Chinese communism, or whatever it is, by constructing one's own system makes no sense. A system which seeks to assert its primacy over another system has all the demerits of the first system. You look at democracy at the moment, and in this country, you see a bizarre decision to vote for taking ourselves out of the first division, the Brexit decision. You look at America, and you see, first of all, an election in which the winner gets 3 million fewer votes than the loser. And you see the election of a president who is plainly not just mendacious, but beyond, has no abilities which enable him to do the job, not just in a lawful way, but understanding the niceties which go alongside any set of constitutional arrangements. So you look at those things and you think, democracy is far from perfect, but you also you can look at countries which are democratic and work extremely well, and which produce, through democracy, solutions to or the beginnings of solutions to the problems they face. I think that's just happened in France. Monsieur Macron will have some terribly difficult times ahead, but he is a response to those problems, and was elected at an absurdly early age. Right? I don't mean it's wrong to have young people, but I mean, you know, he's about the same age as my daughters. It's amazing. You look at Germany, which has been, after a terrible period in the first half of the century, which in the second half of the last century has turned itself round and emerged not only from the economic rubble, but from the moral rubble as well. So I think that I would argue that the weight of argument was in favour of the rule of law, open accountability, free press, free academic inquiry, and the use as much as possible of the price mechanism to try to allocate resources.
That's the liberal part of the democracy.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say, David, I wouldn't say that that is always perfect.
Either, yeah. Have you ever read Ayn Rand, for example?
Yeah.
To me, I don't know. I mean, in my understanding of the world, her view is that the individual is all important, and the ability of the individual to create and to deliver and to do the best that they can do for themselves will make for a better society, because society will be better because of that.
But I think she had a tremendously negative effect on American political debate and argument.
Really?
Yeah, because she encouraged Americans to regard government as the enemy.
Aha, that's where I feel too.
I mean, if you think about the most influential speech made domestically in modern American history, it was that speech which Ronald Reagan perfected when he was making paid speeches for GE,
Right.
and when he was campaigning for Barry Goldwater. And he made that speech in which he said that the most dangerous words in the English language were, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help." And it was the core of an extremely clever speech, which, to be fair, he didn't practice when he was in office. You look at the way in which the American deficit, spending deficit, went up. But the assertion, which was picked up by Republicans and by lobbyists and by the financial services industry, was that any regulation by government was a bad thing. Glass-Steagall, of course, went that government spending was a bad thing, you had to slash it, that Keynes and deficit financing were the forerunners of socialism or communism. And you got, on the back of that, you got the abandoning of sensible controls over banking. You got the abandonment of any sort of regulation, and it produced eventually, first of all, a real squeeze on what the Americans call middle class, we'd call working class standards of living, and an explosion because of that in borrowing, and eventually 2007, 2008, 2009, the Tea Party, the destruction of a sensible centre-right party in American politics, which is why Donald Trump was able to take it over, the great takeover artist. And there was the Republican Party ready for being taken over. I mean, my favourite, which may surprise you, my favourite American president after Harry Truman who I think was a very, very great man, was Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower,
The general.
the general, Eisenhower in a way baked into the American economy the best bits of Roosevelt. And you had that extraordinary highway building program. You had the investment in the defense industries, which helped produce some of the extraordinary breakthroughs in American academia and American research, including the internet. You had, including IT, you had huge public spending, you had huge housing programs, and it was the high point of the middle class, provided you were white. I mean, it wasn't good for African Americans, but for the white, for the sort of I Love Lucy middle class, it was a heyday, and it's very interesting.
Could you compare that to China in any way now?
No,
Do you see the rise of the middle class of China?
Yes, you can see the rise of the middle class in China, but what you don't see in China is the same narrowing of in social equity. I mean, the 1950s and early 60s saw the lowest Gini coefficient in modern American history. People were getting better off. If you were a boss in a big company, maybe you were getting 30 times what the average mean wage was. Nowadays, what would you be getting? 300, 400, 500 times. And I think that...
But you don't see that in China? When I travel around to cities like Ningbo, Dalian, the secondary cities, I am always shocked at how they've built their infrastructure, the development of the people, the economies, the cars that people are driving. I feel that there's a tremendous growth in that area.
Well, why don't the Chinese allow the publication of the Gini coefficient for China and the real figures on social equity? Because they find them slightly embarrassing, just as they find the figures for air pollution slightly embarrassing. And I mean, they're the sort of points that, to their credit, are sometimes admitted by Chinese officials. I mean, when Jiabao was regularly making speeches about the four uns, the things that had to be changed in China, and one of them was, of course, the imbalance in wealth and earnings between the best off and the least well off. I mean, the people who arrive in Hong Kong with a suitcase full of money,
Yes.
to buy a flat. I mean, the figures in Hong Kong aren't far from perfect, but they're a lot better. One of the things that always amused me. I mean, a great thing about being governor of Hong Kong after being a British politician is most of us in politics like to get things done. And because of human vanity, you like to see things from intellectual creation to completion. And normally in politics that doesn't happen.
Yes.
Partly because it takes so long in Europe and America to get things done, partly because you're moved before completion of whatever it is, a hospital or a bridge or a road or whatever. And then you've got the difficulty that you're always having to make rather difficult choices about priorities. 5 years in Hong Kong, and I don't think I ever had to make a difficult choice about priorities because the economy had been growing for almost 30 years. Every year we increased public spending, we cut the deficit, We cut borrowing. We cut tax. We built that airport. In effect, it would have been better to have borrowed the money, but we weren't allowed to. So we built the airport out of revenue. It was extraordinary, and you could take initiatives in areas like disability or the health service. People were streaming out of private provision back into public provision because the standards were so high. And I used to be criticised by mainland officials for being a socialist, for spending too much, but we could do it.
But in 1997, as you're handing over the keys, right? At that point, you didn't see that China could become the second largest economy in the world.
Well,
you're saying, look, China has still not proven. It's like France is still bigger and Germany is still bigger than UK. But today, they are not anymore. And China has managed to become the second largest.
Yes, but if you were a Chinese official, the thing which would most concern you is the rate of change in per capita income and not just the total. I mean, with 1.36 billion people, if you're growing at the sort of spectacular rates that China did for 3 decades of doubling the economy about every 8 years, inevitably, because there are so many of you, you overtake everybody else. I mean, before long, the Indian population is going to be bigger than the Chinese.
True.
And the Chinese are moving from faster than any country ever has before, from a labour shortage to a labour surplus. I mean, from a labour surplus to a labour shortage. So things move, and that has consequences. But I think I can honestly say that since I'd first seen China in 1979 and have gone on seeing it reasonably regularly since, I never had any doubt. One, that the development of China was the second most important political event of my lifetime. Secondly,
what was the first one?
The collapse of communism in Europe. Secondly, that was going to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And thirdly, that if that were to stop, if that were to go into reverse, the consequences, not just for China, but for the rest of us, would be a disaster. So when somebody like Larry Summers looks at in a rather mechanistic way, at what's happened to the fastest growing economies, the ones which have enjoyed real spurts of growth, yes. And once they start to slow down, and argues that they fall on average by 4.5%. I think to myself, I hope that doesn't happen in China.
Well, economic statistics, I think you're correct in saying, are not reliable. But I think they're not reliable.
Li Keqiang thought they weren't, doesn't think they're reliable. I mean, so why should the rest of us?
But I think they could not be reliable in a surprising manner. Because if you look at the average person, right, and you look at what their salaries are, how are they able to go across and travel the world and now become the largest number of tourist exits in the world at 120 to 140 million last year? How are they able to go and buy Versace bags? How are they able to buy apartments?
There are a lot of very well-off Chinese,
and you don't read a lot of them. And I think this statistic is, and also there's a lot of lower-level Chinese that are still able to go outside and still able to do things. Of course, there's a lot that cannot, hundreds of millions. But it amazes me that people with a supposed salary of 3 to 5 or 10,000 RMB a month are actually hopping between Switzerland down to go see the Spanish coast.
A day in Venice. buying
So perhaps
chateau wines.
and there's an argument to be said that perhaps, yeah, exactly.
Look, the first time I went to China, the first time I saw China was 1979, as I said to you. And I was visiting Hong Kong when Murray Macleod was governor with 3 other MPs, young MPs. And we were taken up to the border at Lo Wu.
I remember that. To look over the Shenzhen that didn't exist, right?
By the time I left, having had a career in British politics and then went out to Hong Kong again, by 1997, it was it was an astonishing capitalist explosion.
Sure.
A bit Adam Smith and a bit Wild East or Wild West. The first time I went to Shanghai, I'm interested in jazz and I wanted to go and hear the band in the Peace Hotel.
Yeah, still there, I think.
Yeah. And we went up the Bund, and you were almost literally going from one dim street lamp to another. So things changed and changed dramatically, and one has watched the development in Shanghai of Pudong.
Amazing.
But also it was a Chinese taking me round the other day, the other year, who said it was early evening, and he said to me, look when the lights go on or don't go on in some of these buildings. And you did what he was saying to me was that there was quite a lot of overcapacity. But nevertheless, what's happened is astonishing, and it's good for China, it's good for humanity.
What about the next 20 years? What will Hong Kong's final demise come, and Shanghai rise? Or will
because of what I said earlier, that Hong Kong has some qualities and attributes which, in my view, will continue to give it an extraordinary advantage, despite the fact that it's competing with much larger communities.
Well, where will China be in 20 years in your mind from now? Where will it be in 100 years from now?
I don't know. In 20 years from now, it will be trying to pay for a huge increase in the number of the elderly. I mean, China's going in 20 years' time, the largest population group in the world will be Indian. The second largest population will be China. Probably the third largest population group will be Chinese pensioners. And that is, I'm not saying that in any sort of triumphalist way.
Reality.
It's a reality. If I had my time over again, I'd be a demographer. I mean, I think demography teaches one so much about society and about economics and about history, and it teaches you a lot about European history and African history at the moment. I hope that China will continue to do well, but I don't believe that China will go on growing at the rate it's shown in the last few years. And I also observe some of the problems identified by the man I think is the most interesting of today's generation of Chinese leaders. I mean, he's not probably as outstanding as Zhu Rongji, who only, alas, got one term as Prime Minister, who's most impressive public official I've ever encountered.
Yes, very impressive man.
But
the Asian crisis, his handling of the Asian crisis was masterful.
It was. It is said that Wang Qishan, who's now his time consumed by the fight against corruption, became very interested in that book by Alexis de Tocqueville, the Ancien Régime and the French Revolution, which I know very well because I had to do it my first term at university. And I had to read it in French, and I wrote lots of essays about it. And the 2 points which apparently made Wang think hard, and the reasons why I think he got the Central Party School to read it, and the Central Committee and the Politburo, were these. First of all, it's a wrong assumption that when people get better off, they're easier to govern, they're easier to manage. And de Tocqueville points out that in the 18th century, in the run-up to the French Revolution, the peasantry and even people in cities were actually getting better off. And what effect did that have? It made them more aware of how much better off they wanted to be, and how much better off other people were. Made them a bit more envious. And the second thing that he identified, which is a big point of de Tocqueville's argument, is that authoritarian governments, and I just say that as not judgmentally but descriptively, are always at their most vulnerable when they start to take their foot off the brake and when they start to ease up, which is what happened in France in the 1780s. So what I'm saying is I think the management of change in China, and it's a point I made earlier, is incredibly difficult. But it's in all our interest that the Chinese leadership get it right.
It goes back, I mean, I was musing when I was writing this cover story about London, and thinking about 1997, when you were handing over, I was watching from the harbour, and I was thinking about what this was the second handover, the first one being when Queen Victoria took it over. And what would Queen Victoria think if she looked at China today and saw them investing in the nuclear power plants and buying football teams in the UK and buying banks, and what would she think? And what,
Well, I prefer the Chinese to be buying football teams than the Russians buying them. But that's
why?
It just underlines the fact that I'm not a great Chelsea supporter. Well, she might be. She might have had this. Who knows? She might have had the same views on China as Napoleon had. Napoleon, you recall, took the view that once China woke up, watch out the rest of the world. But, it's really important I think for all of us, I'm going to have to stop in a minute, but for all of us, first of all, to have a real sense of history. That until 1820, China was a third of the world economy. And with India it was 50.
In the 1400s, when they sent out Admiral He.
Absolutely.
And he came back and they burnt his ships, and they said, there's no point to go out into the world because we have everything we need.
Absolutely, and that's what they said to Macartney in 1793. So China's big and extraordinary civilization. But it's not the only civilization in the world. And the one thing it's been terrific at the visual arts. It's been extraordinarily inventive. And for a time, it was very good at governing itself. And the real question is whether the way it governs itself is suitable for the 21st century. But I don't think that China has anything about government particularly to teach us. I think that it's I've listened with some sympathy to what you've said about China going out into the world, the growth of the Chinese middle class. But what surprises me is that China's soft power isn't greater than it is, and that the Chinese global footprint isn't bigger than it is. Who have been China's closest friends in the last few years? Venezuela, Zimbabwe.
There could be a Machiavellian plan that we don't know about, with the Mandarins having sent out their people for years to go study with J.P. Morgan and come back, and now accumulating 1 trillion or 2 trillion of U.S. debt, and suddenly
the Chinese themselves
destabilizing the system. But they haven't done that.
The Chinese themselves point out. The Chinese Education Ministry does from time to time. How many of their best postgraduates don't go back? No, they're not the only people in that position. In Europe, and I'm a free trader in most things, but I feel slightly sensitive about the drain of talent from Europe to America. I run a university, so I would be. Yet fortunately, at least until now, we've been able at Oxford and Cambridge and Imperial in London to attract people. We have in Oxford 1,000 Chinese students, about 150 from Hong Kong and the rest from the mainland. And we've got 160 professors, academics teaching, and not just teaching about China, medicine, economics, business, physics, teaching right across the board, and as well as teaching about China and Chinese language. So I'm aware of the amount of talent that China has, and will be interested to look over the years at how much of that talent remains in outside China and how much of it goes back. And I think the amount that goes back will depend on China allowing its universities rather more freedom perhaps than they have at the moment. On Tuesday this week, we had a opening of what's called the Big Data Institute in our Medical Sciences Division at Oxford. I was talking to a Chinese doctor at that, researcher, who I would guess is a very, very likely candidate for a Nobel Prize. Extraordinarily talented, brilliant scientist. And all that exists. I know that. And it's good for humanity, whether they're Chinese or American or Montenegrin.
Thank you very much for your time.
Not at all.
It was a pleasure to meet you.
Not at all. Well, it's been the most interesting and happiest period of my life was the one I spent in Hong Kong. As I said to you, and my family would say the same, as I said to you, I think that not the emergence of China, but the re-emergence of China after some dark ages has been the second most significant event of my lifetime, politically and economically, and that it is in no one's interest that it should end.
Well, let's hope it doesn't.
Let's hope it doesn't. Well done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.